I'm Joshua, 28, and I never thought I'd write about my family on Reddit. But after what happened last summer at my grandparents' barbecue, I knew I had to share. My family has always had this strange dynamic. My uncle Darren, in particular, seems to take personal offense to my existence. He enjoys subtle digs, the kind that make everyone else laugh while I sit there pretending I'm not burning inside. My cousin Callum, who is about 2 years younger than me, has clearly learned from Darren. My parents sometimes hover on the sidelines, pretending to be neutral, but it's obvious they enjoy the chaos as much as Darren does. The barbecue that day was at my grandparents' house, a big, old place with a sprawling backyard and a grill that Darren insists on controlling like he's the king of summer feasts. I got a text from my mom that morning, simple as always, family barbecue today at 3. Hope you can make it. I almost didn't go. Usually, these gatherings are exhausting, full of judgment disguised as concern, but I decided to go. Partly because I wanted to assert my presence, and partly because I thought, maybe this time, it would be different. When I arrived, the backyard was buzzing. My Aunt Marlene was fussing over the table settings with surgical precision, insisting that the napkins be perfectly folded. Darren was at the grill, moving around with exaggerated importance, flipping burgers and making everyone else step back. Callum was hovering nearby, wearing that smirk that said he was ready to mock me the second I turned my back. I stepped out of my car in a neat button-up and slacks. I wasn't trying to impress anyone, just dressed like a professional adult, which apparently was a crime in this family. Darren's eyes locked onto me immediately, and I could feel the tension before he even spoke. "Shouldn't you be in uniform?" he called, loud enough for a few neighbors to glance over. For a split second, I froze. Then I realized what he meant. My brief stint waiting tables months ago, something I had moved on from entirely. Before I could respond, Callum's voice cut in, snide and rehearsed. "Yeah, the waiter's late, isn't he?" A few cousins chuckled, and my mom gave me that helpless look, the one that says, "I know they're cruel," and I tried to stop it, but I failed. I forced a smile and kept walking, trying to act unaffected, but the sting was there. Darren wasn't done. "Wow, Josh, all dressed up. Trying to look important now." His tone was mocking, slow, as if he expected the entire backyard to erupt in laughter. A few distant relatives glanced over, unsure whether to get involved. I made it inside to grab a drink, deciding it was smarter to avoid a direct confrontation in front of everyone. But that's when Mr. Whitaker, my grandfather's longtime friend, approached. He's this retired businessman, quiet, precise, the kind of person who makes you feel like your life choices are being audited without words. "Joshua, what have you been up to these days?" he asked casually. I gave him the short version: freelancing, consulting, a few marketing campaigns I was managing. He nodded politely, then said, "Mind if I see your LinkedIn?" "Sure," I said, curious. He scrolled slowly, every movement deliberate. I watched Darren and Callum from the corner of my eye, expecting them to jump in with more barbs. Instead, I noticed their expressions change almost imperceptibly. They thought this would be another opportunity to humiliate me, but it wasn't turning out that way. Mr. Whitaker's brow furrowed, then lifted, and he leaned closer to the phone. "Joshua, these projects, managing teams across multiple states, overseeing campaigns for major companies, and running this many clients at your age, this is impressive." A hush fell over the backyard. The laughter from earlier was gone. Darren's smirk faltered. Callum's usual laugh died mid-chest. Even my mom's eyes widened, like she'd just realized something she hadn't known. Grandpa leaned over, squinting at the phone, whispering something to Marlene. I couldn't hear it, but the tension was tangible. No one said a word after that. I sipped my drink, pretending to be casual, but inside I was buzzing. For years, Darren and Callum had made it their mission to make me look small, and now, finally, the perception was starting to shift. Then came the moment that made my chest tighten with anticipation. Mr. Whitaker, still scrolling, stopped and looked up sharply at Darren. "I see you've invested in a few of the companies Joshua's consulted for. Quite a small world, isn't it?" I swear you could hear the sizzling of the grill louder than anyone's voice. Darren's jaw tightened, Callum's smirk vanished completely, and my mom looked like she was processing a disaster that had been sitting in front of her all afternoon. The air felt charged, like something had shifted irreversibly. I knew in that instant that this barbecue would not be casual, normal, or forgettable. This was just the opening move, and I could sense that Darren and Callum were already planning their next desperate moves. And then Callum, in that infuriatingly bratty voice, said, "Wait, wait. Are you seriously telling me you've been doing all this while working at that restaurant? That's..." He trailed off. He didn't know what to say, and Darren was frozen in a way I'd never seen before. Everyone in the backyard seemed to collectively hold their breath. I smiled, quietly, savoring the moment. I could feel the weight of every eye on me, Darren and Callum frozen in ways that made me almost giddy. I sipped my drink slowly, pretending to be casual, but inside, I was buzzing with this quiet, simmering satisfaction. For years, I'd been the butt of jokes at family events. I'd endured whispered insults, condescending looks, and pointed remarks in front of everyone. And now, for the first time, it felt like the spotlight had shifted. Darren finally broke the silence, though it came out more like a hiss than a sentence. "Well, Joshua, that's impressive, I suppose." He tried for casual, but his eyes were tight, sharp, and calculating. He had that same look my father would get when he was plotting something, and I instantly recognized it. Darren was already thinking about how to turn this around in his favor. Callum, on the other hand, didn't even know how to respond. His mouth opened, then closed, like he was trying to remember some joke he had planned earlier. I could see the gears turning in his head. He hated losing, hated looking foolish, and now he was faced with something he couldn't immediately mock. Mr. Whitaker continued scrolling through my LinkedIn, occasionally nodding, murmuring things like, "That's remarkable," or "I didn't realize you were managing all this." Each small comment seemed to tighten the tension in the backyard. Darren shifted slightly at the grill, flipping a burger with a little more force than necessary. Callum, sensing he needed to regain control, started wandering around, muttering something about checking on the cooler, trying to look busy, but I could see the flush creeping up his neck. My mom hovered near the table, clearly torn between wanting to support me and wanting to maintain her peacekeeping role. "Joshua, maybe you should sit with Mr. Whitaker," she said quietly. I appreciated the attempt, even if it came late. I followed him to a corner of the backyard, away from the grill and the lingering relatives. "Joshua," he said, still looking at his phone, "I don't normally say this, but with your experience, you're in a position most people would kill for by your age. It's extraordinary." I smiled politely, not letting my excitement show. "Thanks. I've been working on a few long-term projects recently, but it's mostly been consulting work. Not much big deal." He chuckled softly, but there was this glint in his eye, like he was suddenly realizing something about the dynamic in my family. "I can see why you might downplay it here," he said. "Some of the people in this family seem, well, they're not used to seeing someone achieve on their own." I laughed quietly, but it wasn't the kind of laugh that tried to mask embarrassment. It was quiet, satisfied. He was right. Darren and Callum thrived on belittling me, on controlling the narrative. For decades, they had been the ones shaping the family's perception, and I had been content to fade into the background just to avoid the drama. But that was over. I glanced toward the grill, and my eyes caught Darren, leaning slightly, pretending to adjust the barbecue while clearly eavesdropping. His jaw was tight, his hands clenched just enough that I could see the tension. Callum was pacing in short loops, muttering something under his breath I couldn't quite catch, and every few steps, his gaze darted toward Mr. Whitaker and me. I leaned closer to Mr. Whitaker and whispered, just enough for him to hear, "If you want, I can show you a few of the campaigns I've been working on. Nothing major, just enough to give you an idea." He nodded, tilting his phone slightly so he could glance at me without signaling anyone else. "I'd like that." At that moment, Darren snapped. He stomped over, acting like it was casual, though his movements were far too deliberate. "Joshua," he said, loud enough to draw a few glances from cousins nearby, "why don't you show Mr. Whitaker what you do? While you're at it, maybe we can explain to everyone here what it means to have a real job." The subtle jab at my restaurant job was thinly veiled, but he made sure everyone could hear. Callum snickered just a little, the kind of nervous, half-laugh that always comes when someone is hoping their cruelty lands. I took a slow sip of my drink, letting a beat stretch, and then, casually, I said, "Actually, Darren, I'm happy to. Do you mind if I use your grill table? It's closer to the sun." The backyard went silent for just a second. Darren's face twitched. Callum froze mid-step. I could see the flicker of realization cross Darren's eyes. He thought this was going to be a performance where I stumbled or got flustered. Instead, I was about to show off exactly why I hadn't been at this family event for approval, but for something much bigger, recognition I had earned on my own. I set my drink down and walked to the grill, pretending to inspect the setup, and then I pulled out my laptop from my backpack. I didn't even wait for permission, just opened it and connected to Mr. Whitaker's phone via Bluetooth so he could see everything clearly. Darren's jaw tightened further, and Callum's small laugh had completely died. "What are you doing?" Darren finally asked, his voice a little too sharp. "Just showing Mr. Whitaker a few projects I've been managing," I replied casually. "Some are small, some are larger. Thought you might like to see the kind of work that's kept me busy since the restaurant." The first slide loaded, and the screen displayed client logos that a few relatives recognized instantly. Big names, some that even Darren had invested in indirectly through ventures he had bragged about at dinner years ago. A few eyebrows raised. A few whispers started, but Darren cut them off with an almost imperceptible glare, trying to assert control, though it was clear he was flailing. Callum, desperate to regain some semblance of dominance, leaned over, pointing at a spreadsheet on the screen. "Wait, are you seriously saying you manage all of this alone?" His voice wavered, a mix of disbelief and panic. I nodded slowly. "I manage a team of 5 full-time consultants and another 8 contractors. The campaigns are running simultaneously. Budgets, timelines, strategy sessions, everything. Most of this work started while I was still technically at the restaurant." Darren's face went a little pale. He took a step back and muttered something about needing to check on the burgers, but his movements were too jerky to be convincing. Callum was pacing again, muttering under his breath, clearly overwhelmed. Mr. Whitaker looked up from his phone and said, "Joshua, this is impressive. I had no idea you were operating on this scale. Some of these campaigns intersect with investments Darren has been involved in, and I can't help but notice that you've handled them more efficiently than the teams he's outsourced." The backyard was silent. The air felt thick, as if the summer heat had been replaced by some invisible pressure. Darren's face had hardened into a mask I didn't recognize, a mixture of shock, anger, and the beginnings of panic. Callum was biting his lip, trying to look nonchalant, but failing miserably. I realized, in that moment, that the next moves they made would either make this family event utterly chaotic or possibly catastrophic for them. They were used to controlling the narrative, belittling me, and getting everyone else on their side. Now the narrative had flipped completely, and they didn't know how to handle it. I sipped my drink again, casually, as if none of this mattered, but inside, I was already thinking 3 steps ahead. Every look from Darren and Callum told me they were plotting. I knew exactly how this was going to escalate, but for the first time, I wasn't going to retreat. That's when Callum leaned in, almost whispering but loud enough for me to hear. "You think this proves something? But wait until everyone finds out what Darren has been hiding." I froze. Something had just shifted from family awkwardness to something deeper. I could feel the tension ripple through the backyard again. Darren's hands clenched at his sides, his face a shade darker, and my mom gave me a warning glance, almost like she could sense the storm about to break. And then, right at that moment, my grandfather's phone buzzed. He looked down at it, his expression tightening, and said something to Mr. Whitaker that I didn't quite catch, but the way Darren stiffened told me that whatever was being said wasn't good for him. The air grew heavier, the entire backyard silent except for the faint sizzle of the grill. I realized then that this wasn't just about my achievements or their failed attempts to humiliate me anymore. This was something bigger, something that could unravel everything Darren and Callum thought they had under control. The backyard was quiet, but it wasn't the peaceful kind of quiet. It was the kind where every conversation, every movement, felt like it was being measured. Darren stood near the grill, pretending to flip burgers, but clearly frozen, his face taut with tension. Callum, pacing in short, jerky steps, kept glancing at Mr. Whitaker's phone, as if willing it to disappear. My mom hovered near the table, hands clasped, clearly nervous about how far this was going to go. I set my drink down again and walked closer to the table, laptop in hand, feeling an odd thrill. This wasn't just about proving myself anymore. It was about showing Darren and Callum that they couldn't control the story anymore, that for once, their years of subtle cruelty were no match for evidence. "Mr. Whitaker," I said casually, opening another file. These are reports from the last 3 campaigns I managed. It's not just client names or project scopes. It's analytics, projections, and the outcomes. Feel free to scroll through. He leaned closer, clearly impressed, and began swiping through the slides. Each one detailed strategy meetings, revenue increases, market expansion plans, things that required precision, foresight, and leadership. Skills Darren and Callum had always implied I lacked, skills they had mocked me for supposedly never developing. Darren's jaw clenched. Callum's smirk vanished completely. Their faces were masks of disbelief and anger, the kind that only comes from realizing the game you've been playing for years has been turned against you. You're showing all of that, Darren said finally, his voice low, strained. Of course, I said, voice calm, deliberate. It's part of my work. I've always had these projects running in the background while you two were busy. Well, doing whatever it is you think counts as important. Callum stepped forward, trying to regain dominance, but his words faltered. You think this changes anything? People are going to see you here at the barbecue, Josh. That's what they remember. That little restaurant job. They'll forget the rest. I laughed softly, but it wasn't mean. It was deliberate, quiet, the kind that carries calm confidence. I don't think so. People notice patterns. They notice results. It's hard to ignore a track record when it's documented. For the first time, Darren moved closer, his posture tense. You're trying to humiliate me, he said, voice low, dangerous. I'm showing reality. I corrected him evenly. Reality doesn't care about your feelings. There was a pause, the kind that stretched long enough for several relatives to glance over, sensing the tension but unsure how to intervene. I could see them in the corners of their eyes, my aunts, cousins, even distant neighbors who had wandered in to say hello. Everyone was watching this subtle, invisible fight unfold. Then Callum, desperate, said, "This isn't fair. You can't. Can't what?" I asked calmly, closing the laptop with a slow, deliberate motion. Can't show what I've built. Can't have achievements beyond your expectations. Can't exist without your permission. Darren's face went red. Callum's jaw tightened. My mom looked like she wanted to intervene, but knew there was no graceful way out for either of them now. It was at that moment that I decided it was time to escalate things further. If I wanted them to truly understand how hollow their power over me had been, I needed to hit where it hurt the most, the thing Darren and Callum valued more than anything: status in the family and the appearance of control. I pulled out my phone and tapped a few keys. I know both of you have been proud of certain investments Darren's made and Callum's been watching closely. Thought you might like to see how those companies have performed against benchmarks I've been tracking. I shared a few screens, carefully curated. They showed comparative growth metrics, leadership effectiveness, and revenue insights from companies Darren had bragged about at dinners and family events. The numbers weren't exaggerated. They were factual, cold, precise. And they didn't favor Darren at all. Darren's face tightened, his knuckles white around the spatula he'd picked up to look busy. Callum's mouth opened, but no words came out. The cousins who had been snickering earlier looked like they had just witnessed a magician reveal the trick. The illusion was gone, and the audience was stunned. I leaned back casually, pretending I was merely passing the time. You see, it's funny, I said quietly, enough for them to hear. How much emphasis has been placed on appearances rather than results. All these years, I was told I was lazy, unambitious, or irrelevant. Meanwhile, you've been measuring me by your own standards, without even knowing what I was capable of. Callum took a step back, muttering, That's not fair." "It's reality," I replied softly. "Fairness doesn't factor into it. Results do. Consistency does. Leadership does. And yes, it's funny how those are exactly the qualities you both spent years trying to downplay." Darren's face had gone a dark shade, a mix of panic and fury simmering just below the surface. He muttered something under his breath, but it was clear he was trying to form a plan. He's the kind of person who thrives on control, and he couldn't comprehend being on the outside of it for once. I could see the gears turning in Callum's head too. He kept pacing, muttering phrases like, "I can't believe this," and he's showing off again, trying to reclaim the narrative, but failing miserably. My mom gave me a subtle glance, warning me that I was pushing too far too quickly, but I ignored it. This was too important. This wasn't just about proving myself. It was about finally showing them that the years of manipulation, judgment, and mockery had no hold over me anymore. And then, Just when I thought the tension had reached its peak, Darren's phone buzzed. He looked at it, eyes widening in a way that made my stomach tighten with anticipation. He glanced at Callum, whispering something so fast I didn't catch it. But their expressions, my God, their expressions said it all. Darren's face paled, Callum's jaw dropped, and even some of the distant relatives started murmuring to each other, sensing something huge was about to unfold. My mom's hand flew to her mouth. The air was thick, charged with anticipation, like the calm before a storm that you know is going to be devastating. Darren's phone buzzed again, and this time he didn't even try to hide the tension. He fumbled with it for a moment before finally looking up, eyes darting around the backyard as if searching for a friendly face that wasn't there. Callum stepped closer, whispering something sharp under his breath, but I couldn't make it out. I didn't need to. Their panic was loud enough in the way they moved, the way their posture shifted, the way their smiles were gone entirely. I walked closer to Darren, keeping my steps slow and deliberate, like I was in complete control. "Everything all right?" I asked casually, though the smile I gave him wasn't friendly. It was measured, precise, the kind that only comes when you know something someone else doesn't and they're about to find out. He swallowed hard. Yeah, fine," Callum muttered. "Josh, maybe you should stop. People are starting to talk." I tilted my head, as if considering it. Stop what? Showing reality. They went silent, which was exactly what I wanted. The murmurs among the cousins had started again, quieter this time, because everyone could sense the shift. This wasn't just awkward family tension anymore. This was something bigger, something that involved secrets, manipulation, and long-standing resentment finally coming to the surface. I pulled my laptop back into view and opened a folder labeled Performance Reports, Confidential. I hadn't planned on showing them everything, but now seemed like the right time. I clicked the first file. It displayed a series of comparative charts, companies Darren had invested in, teams he had managed indirectly, and projects where his decisions had delayed growth or mismanaged budgets. I glanced at Darren and Callum. Their faces were mirrors of disbelief. Darren's eyes were wide, his knuckles tightening around the grill spatula he hadn't let go of. Callum's lips were pressed tight, his jaw visibly working as he tried to form some response that could salvage his pride. "See, Darren," I said softly, loud enough for him and Callum to hear clearly. "It's interesting how often appearances matter more than results in this family. All these years, people have applauded you for investing in things you didn't fully understand, while criticizing me for trying to actually execute projects and deliver outcomes." Darren's face went a darker shade, the veins in his neck visible. "Joshua, this isn't, you're twisting things. You can't just—" "I'm not twisting anything," I interrupted, my tone calm and even. "These are facts. Verified, measurable, and fully documented. You've spent years trying to shape perceptions, to make everyone think I'm not capable of success on my own terms. And now," I paused, letting it hang in the air. "Now, we're just looking at the evidence." Callum shifted uncomfortably, muttering something under his breath. "People will still see him as the waiter. They'll see what I've built, Callum," I said, looking directly at him, my voice quiet but unwavering. "And for the first time, it won't be filtered through your judgment. It won't be manipulated by your influence. People see results, Callum. That's reality, not your little stories." Darren moved closer, trying to regain authority, but his steps were unsteady. "Joshua, you're showing off now. At a family event. You're humiliating me in front of everyone." I leaned slightly, resting my hand on the laptop. "I'm not showing off. I'm clarifying facts. You've spent decades attempting to control the narrative of my life, Darren, and I think it's only fair the truth is visible to anyone willing to pay attention." The air felt thick, like it had condensed around us. Even the cousins who had been quietly snickering earlier were now standing silently, watching, sensing the shift. Marlene, my aunt, had frozen with a serving tray in her hands, unsure whether to intervene or just stand still. Callum finally spoke, his voice low and tight. "Darren, maybe we should, maybe we need to." Darren cut him off with a sharp motion of his hand, muttering something I couldn't catch, his eyes fixed on the laptop screen as if willing it to disappear. I smiled faintly. "It's okay," I said softly. "You don't need to do anything. Just watch." I brought up another file, this one labeled Strategic Plans, past 3 years. I hadn't intended to reveal these at a family barbecue, but the situation had escalated to a point where subtlety was pointless. The documents detailed campaigns, budgets, project timelines, and even correspondence that highlighted strategic thinking. Everything Darren and Callum had mocked me for supposedly lacking. Mr. Whitaker's eyes widened as he scrolled. Joshua, these are incredible. And all of this while you were supposedly just at the restaurant? This is exceptional. I nodded, letting the praise settle. It wasn't about ego anymore. It was about proving a point. Darren's hand twitched at his side, and Callum's pacing became frantic. Their little world, the one they had built around control and superiority, was crumbling right in front of them. People will start asking questions, Darren, I said, soft but deliberate. They'll notice patterns, see results. And it won't take long for them to realize that you've been exaggerating, controlling, and manipulating perception for years, while I've been quietly building reality. Darren's face went pale. Callum's small bravado had evaporated completely. My mom whispered something to herself, like a warning, but I ignored it. The stage was set. And then it happened. Darren's phone buzzed again. He looked at it, and the color drained from his face. He glanced at Callum, whispering urgently, words too low for anyone else to hear, but I didn't need to. His expression said everything. Callum's eyes went wide. He stumbled backward slightly. The cousins exchanged nervous glances. Even Marlene froze, tray halfway to the table. I didn't need to ask what had just been revealed. The combination of Mr. Whitaker's scrutiny, my evidence, and whatever had just arrived on Darren's phone was clearly devastating. I watched Darren's hand shake slightly as he stared at his phone. He whispered something to Callum, who just muttered back, wide-eyed, like he hadn't realized the magnitude of what had just landed in their laps. I didn't need to hear the words. The way their faces tightened told me everything. They were in trouble, and they knew it. Mr. Whitaker looked up from the phone again, glancing at me, and gave this faint nod, almost imperceptible, that said he was fully aware of what had been happening in the background. I smiled faintly, letting the tension stretch out. Darren had spent years presenting himself as a savvy investor, a competent decision-maker in the family, while Callum had perfected the art of mocking and belittling me in public. And now, all of that was crumbling. Joshua, Mr. Whitaker said slowly, still scrolling, you've essentially been running circles around all of them, strategically, financially, and quietly. I can't imagine how long it took to get to this level at your age. I shrugged, keeping my tone casual. It's just work, I said lightly, but inside I was riding this quiet thrill. Years of feeling invisible in my own family, years of being treated like I was beneath them, had led to this moment. Darren finally spoke, his voice low, controlled but shaking at the edges. You've been showing off again, he said, though it was obvious even to him that it wasn't showing off. He was panicking. This isn't how families handle these things. You're making us look bad. I looked at him calmly. I'm not making you look bad. You're revealing who you've been all along. I'm just providing the evidence. Callum muttered something again, pacing slightly, clearly trying to find an angle. People will still think he's just Josh, the waiter, the kid who couldn't. I cut him off, smiling faintly. People notice results. That's reality. And if you hadn't spent all these years focused on appearances, you might have noticed sooner. The cousins, who had been snickering earlier, were now silent. Some were exchanging whispers, eyes wide. The tension in the backyard had shifted completely. The laughter, the casual barbecue chatter, it was gone. All that remained was the crushing realization that Darren and Callum's narrative had failed. Then I made the final move. I opened a folder labeled Family Investments, Analysis, which contained clear, factual comparisons of Darren's ventures against benchmarks and evidence showing poor management decisions he had been trying to pass off as successes. I displayed it on the laptop so Mr. Whitaker and the family could see everything. Darren's face went pale. His hands were trembling now. Callum stopped pacing, frozen mid-step. How did you get all this? Darren asked, barely audible. I collected it, I said simply. Over the years, quietly, because I knew one day it would matter. And today it does. The air felt heavy, charged. Even my mom seemed stunned, finally realizing the full extent of the dynamic that had been hidden behind her husband's and brother's control. What do we do now? Callum whispered to Darren, his voice cracking slightly. Darren shook his head, muttering something that trailed off. Neither of them had a plan because there wasn't one. The evidence was too clear, too public, and the witnesses too numerous. Everyone in the backyard, even those who had tried to side with Darren over the years, could see it. The illusion of competence and superiority they had maintained was gone. I closed my laptop gently. "That's it," I said quietly. "That's all there is. The rest, well, that's up to everyone to decide for themselves." The rest of the afternoon was surreal. Darren and Callum spent it moving around, trying to regain some control, but it was obvious to anyone paying attention that they were lost. They couldn't argue with the facts. They couldn't belittle me anymore because the proof was right there in front of everyone. Mr. Whitaker stayed with me for a while, asking more questions about my campaigns, clearly impressed, while Darren and Callum faded into the background, humiliated and powerless. By the time the barbecue ended, the narrative had completely flipped. Cousins and aunts who had once laughed at me now looked at me with curiosity, respect, and some cautious admiration. Darren and Callum left early, muttering excuses about errands and headaches, but everyone could see the truth. They had been exposed for what they were: manipulative, controlling, and desperate to preserve appearances. I stayed behind for a while, talking quietly with Mr. Whitaker about future projects, letting the silence settle. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The satisfaction came in knowing that for once, I was the one controlling the narrative. For once, I wasn't the one being undermined, belittled, or humiliated. By the end of the day, the situation was clear. Darren and Callum had lost the power they had long thought they held. My mom realized, finally, that she couldn't defend their behavior, and the extended family began to see me differently. Not just as her son, but as someone capable, strategic, and accomplished on his own terms. For the first time in years, I left a family event feeling victorious. Not because I had humiliated them personally, but because the truth had been revealed. The lies, manipulations, and control games that had defined my childhood and young adulthood were over. I had proven, without arrogance or shouting, that they weren't the ones in charge of the family narrative anymore. And Darren and Callum? They would spend the next months quietly rebuilding their reputations, knowing that the mask they had relied on for years had been stripped away. The family knew the truth, the evidence existed, and there was nothing left for them to do except watch. For the first time, I walked away from a family gathering unafraid, unapologetic, and untethered from the shadows they had tried to cast over me for decades. I had won, not by shouting, not by revenge in the traditional sense, but by being smarter, patient, and prepared. And the best part? They knew it. Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts in the comments. If you like this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more content like this.